You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to football weather. Certainly not feeling like it outside right now, as it is early July of 2025. Galen Clavio, Matt Blaska joining you once again. Our second episode of the show. Thanks to all of you who jumped on already and have subscribed. It's available everywhere. You can go to Spotify. It's there. It's on Apple Podcasts. It's on pretty much any other place that you would want to get podcasts, as well as on YouTube on the Back Home Network. Matt, great to see you again. Happy 4th of July. Happy birthday. And how you doing?
I'm doing great. It's been a weekend, I would say. I appreciate the birthday wishes. I saw you last night, and my birthday was this past week. I just turned 40, so it's been quite the weekend as my wife just keeps doing random stuff to make things are going well. So it's just been – we had fireworks last night, so I guess that was a nice topping to the weekend. But no, things have been great. I'm looking forward to hopping this. We chatted a little bit last night about some of these things. So I feel like there's so much going on in our college sport echo chamber here.
Yeah, it is one of those situations with college football and college sports in general where the news just never stops. So we're going to talk about some of the big storylines, but as Matt and I were discussing the other day, you could probably do a 5-6 hour podcast and not run out of things to talk about. So we're not going to hit everything, and that's on purpose. But if there's topics that you'd like to see us hit, you can always leave comments on the podcast, either on YouTube or on Spotify. We'll see those. And we'll probably, when August rolls around, we'll put out a call for questions from you folks out there just to make sure that we're answering the things that you want to answer. But we want to go ahead and jump in first and talk about the fact that we are brought to you here on the Back Home Network by Home Field Apparel. Your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. Both of us decked out, I believe, in home field. What do you got going on today?
I got Washington State, the Pac-12 stalwart, if you will, right?
Yes, and I have longtime ACC team SMU joining us on the show, and you can celebrate the reorganization of college sports yourself by purchasing teams that have moved from one conference to the next. Perhaps you're big on celebrating the Pac-12 and you're thinking, you know what would be perfect there? Texas State. Well, check out Home Field Apparel. They got you covered. Or if you wanted to go a different direction and you wanted to, celebrate a team moving from the Atlantic 10 to a larger conference, they probably got those teams as well. Use the code HOME23, get 15% off your first order, and be sure to check them out on social media, homefieldapparel.com, and just tell them that we sent you. They always love it when you do that. Also, just a reminder, I mentioned YouTube earlier. We're on YouTube, and we're on Spotify. You can go to YouTube and search Back Home Network, and go to Spotify, search Football Weather. And if you are interested in joining the community on YouTube, a lot of good comments on the various videos and a chance to see some visual aids as well as we go through. We don't have any graphs or charts on this particular podcast today, but we'll almost certainly have some in the future. And sometimes it's just better to see these things as opposed to just hearing people talk about them. So join us on those venues. We'd love to have you as a part of what we're doing there. All right, Matt, let's go ahead and dive in and talk through some of the items. Let's start off with what felt like a surprise, given that we've been somewhat critical of Tony Pettiti, the Big Ten commissioner, who's been kind of a ghost publicly for the last year with anything involving the league. You see a lot of Greg Sankey out there. You see a lot of Jim Phillips. You see a lot of Brett Yormark. We haven't seen a lot of Tony Pettiti, but Tony Pettiti finally made a pretty extensive public appearance on Joel Klatt's podcast. He might have appeared in some other places too, although I didn't see anything. But I sent it to you immediately. There were clips on Instagram. I was like, oh, my goodness. So you got a chance to watch that whole interview. What were your takeaways just in general from Pettiti finally breaking his silence, so to speak, publicly?
It was really weird just seeing him for a change. You don't. He's just been such a ghost, and now that you see all the commissioners. No, it was really good seeing kind of his thoughts on what this needs to look like for the Big Ten. We talked about last week with him. He's never really come out where Sankey's been out there and all the other folks have given their 2 cents about the 5+11 but he finally got out there and said, here's what we really want to do. We really want the Big Ten regular season to matter. We want more teams involved to late November. He didn't specifically say those things, but you can you can definitely read the tea leaves. That's what he wants. He wants this SEC to go to 9 games. My biggest concern with where he was going, and it just seemed like he's like, I'll take all the ideas. But really, it seems like he has what he wants to do, and he's not going to relent unless the SEC goes to 9. And I think that's good, I guess, that you're pushing all your chips in the middle of the table. But what my biggest concern is if this does happen, this AQ model is, and I think we've seen this with IU and now Nebraska, they're canceling series, right? That people want, but does that really change it in terms of people want to schedule hard non-conference? I'm just talking about the betterment of the sport here, right? Like, does that really help it? And I'm not really sure it does if the AQ model exists, because there's only going to be 2 at-large spots. So you're really not playing for a ton in that aspect. But you then, anytime IU or any team goes 6-3, you're likely going to be playing in one of these playing games for a chance to go to the playoffs. So is that the trade-off for the Big Ten and other leagues that makes more sense for those 4 spots, right? So I think that's really what he was pushing, making the regular season matter more. And he said, I think there would have been 12 teams in the mix from the Big Ten last year during November, early November. So if that's the case, and you want more teams involved, you're certainly going to a more professional model. But he also mentioned we have 136 teams now, right? We have and only 16 go to the tournament, which is the lowest percentage, I think you mentioned last week, by far of any sport. So you really need to be he's really trying to be cognizant of making sure more teams are involved. As a TV guy, that's what you want, right? So we'll see.
Well, there's a lot of different aspects that you have to factor in. And part of the issue is that the starting point for so much of the conversation around what college football is going to do with its postseason begins with how college football ran its postseason up until about, 2014. Right. And that is just such an outdated model at this point in terms of what you could expect college football needs to do in particular. And when we say college football, we really mean college sports in general, because this is the economic engine that's driving everything. But given that we're not even 20 years past the bowls and the BCS being the primary way of deciding a 1 versus 2, and now we're talking about 12 teams, 16 teams. There was some commentary this week, I think it was from Colin Cowherd, talking about how, Pettiti's comments clearly indicate that the Big Ten is planning on there being 16 teams in this next cycle. Yep. And I think everybody is fairly aware of that. What I find interesting about the fight over that is this idea that somehow we're going too far with 16 teams. And this is where I've always struggled with this argument in general. I mean, Pettiti, from the standpoint, I didn't love the arguments that he made because I didn't think they were strong enough in terms of why the model doesn't work and why things are off. And I think you really got to go into granular detail about why the SEC and the way that it is trying to kind of have it both ways with this process, where they want to have 8 games. They want the flexibility of having that extra non-conference game to kind of schedule whatever. Yeah. They want to be able to pad stats. And then they want to have it all up to a committee that is being given very confusing ways of evaluating the teams. And it goes back to something we talked about last week. This is not the NFL or any other professional sport, in that there is a closed scheduling process that only a certain number of teams take part in. And look, you don't play everybody in the NFL, but you play a huge sample of the NFL team population over the course of a whole season, far more of a percentage than you do at the college level. And I think where Pettiti is right, and where I think the supporters of an expanded playoff and automatic bids really need to hammer it home, is that unless there is a change in the way that the conferences, which have gotten way too big, do their own internal scheduling, you're really in a position where you're going to constantly be hitting up against this immovable object of who deserves to be in. And there's no actual way to evaluate deserve. Like, deserve based upon what? There's not a core criteria. The schedules are different. And in football, again, it's like we talked about this a bunch last year. Indiana loses at Ohio State. People acted like it was a disqualifying loss. It's like anybody that loses on the road to a top 4 team, you're going to hold that against them. I mean, if they lose at home, different story. But we've acknowledged that, as we saw in the playoff, home field advantage in these playoff games was really a key. Well, it's the same thing in the regular season. But there's not a good built-in way of evaluating a team otherwise. And this adds to the larger issue of there's no way to objectively say who deserves to be in and who doesn't. And I don't know exactly how you achieve that other than by letting more teams into the dance at the end to try to accommodate that.
Yeah, this isn't the college basketball tournament. This isn't those, right? There's 68, maybe 72, or if we're going forward, teams are going to be in this tournament. So you get a larger sample size of that a conference schedule. That's just not just regardless. I think I read the Big Ten SEC only playing 3 crossovers this year or 4. It's a very low number. So it's really difficult to get any sort of, metric out there that's going to really measure it because it's so fluky. With IU last year, they played Ohio State. They lost. They lost by 20, whatever it was. Their strength of schedule went from 100 to 60, just with that one, whatever it was, right in that range, right? So there's no way to get a definitive metric. Now, if you're going to go with this model, you have to be really intentional of what you're going to do. And like I said, I don't think Pettiti described it well. I think he was just being very he didn't want to say what he wanted to say the entire time. He just kept saying, well, just keep giving me ideas, keep bringing ideas. Well, no, what is your idea? Like, why do you think this is a good idea for not only the Big Ten? Everyone's always looking out for themselves. We also got to think about the larger part of the sport. And I think that's, you go back 150 years to the sport, no one's ever done that, right? We've seen this issue, and now that we have a really good plan, we got to like you said, have people rethink that undefeated seasons are not going to happen. It's not, right? We're going to have 1, 2, 3 lost champions now. We had a 2-loss champion last year, and that's going to keep happening. But how do we now take what we learned from last year, an N of 1, which people are still freaking out about, we talked about last week, and make it a better process, whether the AQs are there or not, but also improving the scheduling model, whether it happen. Hey, if you're a Big Ten team, you got to play your 9 conference games, you got to play 1 ACC and 1 SEC, whatever it has to be, and you need to play one of these smaller conference teams. Something has to come together for the betterment of the sport, and that's where I think Pettiti's maybe not seeing the bigger picture, or maybe I think Sankey's seeing a little bit more of the bigger picture of how this may look.
Well, except I think this is a really good point that you're bringing up, but I would say most people who are not SEC partisans listen to Greg Sankey and watch Greg Sankey and say to themselves, this is a man who is only interested in the SEC. And that's what he gets paid to do. But I think where Pettiti has a real opportunity and where he's not taking advantage of it, and I had a similar complaint about Jim Delaney, so this is not something that's unique to Tony Pettiti, is speak on behalf of college football. Speak on behalf of the future that college football should have, and don't dress it up in such naked self-interest. And have ideas and bring those ideas forward. And yes, of course, the ideas you're going to bring forward should benefit the conference that you're representing, because that's the future you want to see. But you have to couch it in a way that is much more universal, because right now, college football fans in general, I think, are standing around saying, why on earth are we just sitting here and nobody's looking out for our interests? It's always somebody else's interests that are being taken care of. And that's generally just the top teams, which we're going to get to in a little bit with this ACC news. But again, missed opportunity. And I don't think we're going to suddenly see a huge turnaround in terms of what that looks like, with the narrative moving forward. But I would like to see that happen selfishly, because as a Big Ten fan, I'd love to see the Big Ten actually taking a position of leadership as we move forward. But also, I really don't want to see the SEC continue to maneuver the sport in such a way that only benefits them and a very small number of teams at the top. There is a middle ground. It's the same middle ground that most professional sports have found, where they can balance larger market and smaller market teams. They can balance the pay issues and the things that you have to keep in mind in terms of fair compensation for athletes, while also keeping in mind the fans and what the fans would be interested in. I think all of those things are doable, but there's got to be some kind of a change in the narrative. Otherwise, we're never going to get there. And we may never get there. It may just be that it's not a possibility with this group of people.
I think you made a great point there about changing the narrative of the sport, right? Last year, you have teams like Indiana, SMU, Boise State, right, have these moments that they would have never had in the history of college football. And they were IU doesn't deserve to be in the playoff. SMU was the worst team ever. That's where the difference between college basketball tournament, right? We celebrate the Lehighs, we celebrate the UMBCs, right? Those are an exciting thing for the sport. But in college football, when you go against the establishment or the SEC, and the IU happened to be that first game, and I'll never forget people just losing it on IU, and then the next day, blowout. It's like, this is the sport. The home team has an advantage, like you said. In football, more than any other sport, it matters. And instead of celebrating what IU did last year, and they were celebrating having a great year. They lost that playoff game, and you would have thought like they were a 7-6 football team that didn't deserve to be there. Same with SMU and same with Boise State. Boise State was one play away from playing in the semifinals last year. They were really close, right? They probably should have won their game. But anyway, so that's where, like you said, we need to go from, we got to change it. Let's be the leaders here in legends and leaders in the Big Ten and take what we have right now and say, hey, here's what's the best thing for maybe the Big Ten, but we're willing to maybe compromise a little bit here because it will be better for both the ACC, the Big 12, the SC, and the Big Ten, and then all the other conferences. Sorry, Pac-12, you're not part of this group anymore, but really make it better for the sport. So we're having a better conversation. And it's not going to happen overnight, but that we're really celebrating the sport and just not celebrating yelling at each other because the metrics for the 9-3 LSU team are better than the metrics for the 10-2 IU team.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the other aspects of what we saw this week. So there were comments made that were pretty fascinating on behalf of the athletic director at Tennessee, Danny White, who's gradually developing into a guy who seems to be one of the clearer thinkers, or at least someone willing to elucidate clear thoughts in all of this mix about what we're actually looking at. And I mean, why don't you just summarize what we heard out of him and how different it sounded, I guess, within the discourse of college football?
Yeah, I mean, to put it as focused as it is, he's like, we need to start acting like these are employees, essentially, right? I mean, if we're really looking at it like these people, we're paying them to do a job. Yes, they're not officially employees, but we need to actually act like we're doing that instead of having this middle road, right? And he's the one. I'm sure there's other ADs out there that maybe are being anonymous, but he's the one person, even going back a couple of years, he's been saying this for a while. And I think we were chatting yesterday, we don't want to like Tennessee, but it was finally refreshing to hear somebody say, this is where we need to be doing. Like, we need to be, if we're paying this person to do X, Y, and Z, we need to figure out whatever it's going to be, an employment, CBA, whatever's going to happen, an outside source. That has to be the focus of of college athletics going forward. We can't just be this separate middle ground. It's just not going to work. And we're 4 days into this, right? And we're seeing all these issues. Thanks for pulling this up. Yeah. But it's really a bigger issue that we need to see that solved sooner than later.
It's interesting because, so just reading, this was out of a Ross Dellinger article on Yahoo from a few days ago. Basically the premise of the article was Danny White has been pitching his solution in the shadows through a multi-slide deck in an effort to rally support for his passion project, collective bargaining with college athletes. The presentation shown in detail to Yahoo Sports illustrates how a college athlete collective bargaining model might work. In White's model, college athletes would, in fact, not be employees of their schools. The structure calls for the creation of a national employment organization that partners with the Players Association, perhaps already one found in professional leagues, to create a modernized and improved ecosystem for football and men's basketball players. So it tries to split things a little bit in that it stops short of the employment thing, which seems to be just a red line for so many people in college sports for reasons I still do not grasp, but that's a separate thing. But the idea behind this idea of collective bargaining is, or collective negotiation, I think is really key, because as we've seen now in this post-House settlement era, there's a lot of abuses already lurking. We've seen there was a whole set of contracts that were essentially brought forward from Florida State that look very much like the kind of things that are going to get college athletics into trouble again with the courts, because they're incredibly one-sided. And meanwhile, you've got already some vast disparities going on in terms of how much each athlete is making. I mean, this week, Texas Tech pulls the number one offensive line recruit in the state of Texas, and they guarantee him close to $5 million over the course of 3 years. Now, it ends up that the guarantee is not actually that high. It's a lot of incentives. But again, you're talking about, these are professional contracts here. These are things that people, when you look at it from any other angle, if there weren't college teams named on top of them, you'd be like, well, that's just an employment contract. And the big gulf that exists here is the thing I think that's the most endangering to college athletics, and the thing that the people in charge just constantly act like they don't have to acknowledge or think about, which is this idea that you have to treat the athletes as partners. You can't treat them like they are there at your behest and they have to do what you say. And if they don't, then they can go away and you'll get other people. That's just not how the system works. And what worries me is that seems to be the thing that colleges took out of the House settlement, was that, oh, we've got the old rules back again. And that's clearly not what's happening.
Well, yeah, they're like, oh, we also have this transfer portal over here that we also want to minimize to one time a year, but also want to fit it in an academic calendar while trying to have them go to class and get an employment contract all at the same time. I don't know. Like, it is wild. I was just reading a Texas Tech article earlier, and this is their first ever 5-star recruit. So no surprise there. The Texas Tech, not going to say they're becoming a power, but they're certainly going, with the money they have coming in, they're going to do really well. But regardless, we're going to see more of this, you would think, right, going forward. But you're right. With those Florida State contracts, there's a lot of interesting language in there that's going to get them probably back in court. And how's that going to look going forward? We talked about this yesterday, or maybe whenever it was, about what's stopping these teams essentially from just going over the private schools from going over this cap. They don't have to report anything at this point, right? So there's like the Northwestern and the Duke can really do whatever they want. But as you said yesterday, there needs to be some sort of rule. Hey, you need to show what exactly you're spending your money on. There needs to be some sort of variance here, or not variance. There needs to be some sort of structure. Otherwise, we're in the same boat we've been with the handshake deals, the bag dropping, whatever it's going to be, NIL. Nothing's going to change in that aspect. It's just going to be whatever the fair market value is, quote unquote, for whoever they're going to pay, and that's being run by NIL Go or whatever right at this point. So I think I really like where Danny White's going here. It's going to take a lot of other people on board to go there. And I think if he can gain some more momentum, it's really going to help the sport.
The flip side, and this is an argument I haven't seen talked about much, but I think it's very legitimate at this point. As much as the schools seem hesitant to make changes that would create collective bargaining, it's really benefiting top-level athletes to not have collective bargaining, to not have to be part of that process. I mean, you think about right now, if you're a top-level athlete, you've got everybody competing for your services. You've got everybody throwing money your direction. You've seen some people change teams that they're committed to already in this cycle, and it's clearly based upon NIL and rev share. You've got guys committing places they would have never committed to before. And that is an unregulated market where the market itself needs to look and say, for our best interest, we should probably be regulating this thing. And we're not, because we're afraid of something else. And it reminds me a little bit of the NBA, where you think about the way that the collective bargaining agreement is negotiated. The NBA Players Association is largely led by your very top players, right. The Chris Pauls, that type of player, who, if you look at what's happened in the NBA over the course of the last several years, they have made it so that if you are a top player, a multi-time all-star, a superstar, you're going to get an insane amount of money, significantly more than the mid-tier or lower players. And that ends up both hurting the league and hurting the bulk of the players. But that's how that whole sport is set up. I'm curious with college sports, you really do need somebody to come in from outside who's got expertise in the marketplace and create a continuum where I'm intrigued by the idea of, for instance, the NFL Players Association being perhaps the third party that works with college football on behalf of college football players. because you really need to negotiate classes here. You need to negotiate, like, here's the baseline, here's the minimum protections people have. And it's not just money, it's about contractual protections. There was a lot of stuff in that Florida State set of tweets that we read about how they can terminate the contract unilaterally for injury reasons or other reasons. Well, imagine that happening in pro football or where, sorry, you're injured, now we just don't have to pay you anything. I mean, that would never fly.
Right.
But that's the kind of thing that you have to take into account as you're working through how these things operate. And absent a grassroots college sports-based union across multiple sports, which does not seem likely, this might be a model that would work. But college athletics has got to get together and say, look, we might not get as big of an advantage as we had before, but we're still going to have an advantage here. We might as well just ensconce this rather than maintain this unregulated marketplace, which is going to create all kinds of problems, especially when, as in the case of Texas Tech or in the case of BYU or some of these other schools, there's no way to regulate how much money they're spending and what they're spending it on. There's no way to track it. It's a mess that needs to be regulated internally without expecting somebody from outside like Congress to regulate it for you.
Yeah, and there's right. So going forward, they need to be more specific in what the languages look like. And I think it's Darren Heitner who's been really specific about what needs to be in these contracts. And it can't be this injury clauses, very little about going to class, as we talked about too. We probably at some point are going to be separating those two, right? Those, because it's not going to matter. But certainly once you go down that road, and I was talking to someone who I know really closely about this and about about his job in general. It's like right now we're on the clock 24/7 for these athletes because there's nothing that they're scheduled for. But if you get a CBA, hey, we can only practice actually 18 hours a week. We only play a game for 3 hours a week, and we do school the other, whatever it happens to be. That helps out employees all the way down, not only from the head coach, but then he has to fit and schedule in there, and then you have the athletic trainers and so forth. So all that is a bigger piece of the pie as well that we also need to consider. That's not only beneficial for the athletes, because it's gotten so out of control that these athletes are on campus like 340 days of the year, right? And with really no recourse, I guess they could just say, I'm just not going to play, all right, or they're not going to come to practice. So all that, and again, we're only 6 days into this, but as you know, we never really look ahead at all in college athletics. So we should have foreseen some of these things that might come down the pike. But I'm interested to see if if Danny White can get more folks on board with this. I think that's the real key, because right now, probably he's maybe he's the lone soldier, very going against a lot of the people that are not for this. And I think that's going to take a lot of time to really build on this. On this CBA, what it's going to look like.
Well, look, I do think that coaches in general and some athletic directors are in favor of this. But the problem is I don't think that the schools and the conferences care that much, because they are still convinced that they can put the genie back into the bottle somewhat. And you're seeing that in the way that they're approaching all of these House settlement items. You're also seeing it in how we're still watching evolutionary items related to conference alignment happening. Right. And it's like we don't even have the top of the house in order, let alone all of the things that go along with it. And when it's directly affecting the competitive aspects of the sport, that is definitely a concern. And I think that ultimately it's been beneficial to certain teams, and it's been unbeneficial to some of the more traditional brands over the course of the last couple of years. And there's some benefit to that, but it's almost accidental that it's happened that way. Yeah. And there has to be something more sustainable where at least everybody understands what the rules are, players and schools alike. Going to our final topic today, let's talk a little bit about the news that broke earlier this week regarding the updated terms of the ACC's legal settlement with FSU and Clemson. So this was an article. There were several different places that wrote articles about this. Matt Baker from The Athletic had one. There was a 68-page agreement that was filed. And essentially, if you read the fine print with this, and several people have, David McKenzie on Twitter has done a really good job with this. It's fascinating. because what he sees out of this is essentially the future death of the ACC timed up to sync up almost exactly with when all the television contracts reset at the end of this decade, allowing a pathway for certainly Clemson and FSU, but also some of the other teams in the upper echelon of the ACC to either create their own football-only conference or split off and go their own separate ways without having to pay a huge amount, relatively speaking, to what they would have paid under the old grant of rights agreement. So in layman's terms, there was a contract signed between ESPN and the ACC that made it essentially financially impossible or incredibly prohibitive for most of these schools to break that contract and go somewhere else. This new negotiated deal makes it a lot less prohibitive and makes it seem pretty likely that we're just running out the clock now in the ACC before you've got a much smaller group of teams.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, right? The next 5 years, they will both be in the conference. And I love someone, I can't remember who tweeted this or X'd it, I guess. They'll be by the 2031, they'll be paying a Jimbo Fisher buyout. So, I mean, that's where it's going to land. No, it's interesting. I mean, we knew this existed. We knew this is why the lawsuit dissolved. It is interesting that they do have a super league clause in there that if that were to happen, that there is, I forget the exact name of it is, that optional of limited withdrawal. So to essentially, if a single sport league exists, they can go their separate way. They will $75 million or 50% of the current withdrawal figure, whichever is greater. So you're thinking about the schools like Florida State, Clemson, Miami, North Carolina. Those would be the four main ones. I don't really know anybody else in that realm right now. Maybe that's probably it. That would really look to jump to that Super League, or that would provide any value. There's been, as you know, there's been talks. I guess Virginia might be the other one, but there's been talks, at least for the Big Ten, like, hey, the one area they don't have, and I guess on the map now, is the South. So you would potentially see maybe that Clemson or Florida State maybe added to the Big Ten, or they would be the two that they would look at. But as we've talked about offline, after what Florida State has dealt with after the last couple of years of Florida State, why would anybody really want to deal with that group of people and their boosters and all that stuff? So it is interesting to see not only the death of potentially the ACC here, because the rest of the schools, I mean, their bottom is a true bottom compared to the other conferences. Where like the Big 12, everyone's mid. The Big 12, the ACC, they have a lot of schools that just don't invest in football, and that really has been the detriment to who they are over the last decade.
Well, they weren't founded as a football league,
right? They're basketball,
and they tried to become a football league by grafting teams that cared about football into the league. Because keep in mind, like the Big East was founded as a basketball conference. It was a bunch of relatively small private schools plus UConn that got together for those purposes in the late 70s, early 80s, out of a bunch of other small conferences that were in and around the Northeast in the first half of the 20th century. So when you add a Miami, when you add a Virginia Tech, when you add
Boston College.
Yeah. I mean, granted, they don't really care that much about football, it appears at this point, but you've fundamentally changed. Pitt, I think, is another one that you could throw into the mix. They've fundamentally changed the tenor of the league, and they've had that tension ever since. And the problem for the ACC now is in the rush to get TV markets, they jammed a bunch of schools into their conference that really didn't add a lot of value. And they've also had a lot of schools that just haven't kept up. So Georgia Tech's a great example of this. Yeah. I mean, that's a program that should have everything going for it. It's in Atlanta. It's got an amazing college football history. They just don't have the investment money-wise, and they can't compete recruiting-wise with not just Georgia, but with any of the other teams that are surrounding. And you could go down the list. There's other schools that fall into that category. North Carolina State has traditionally fallen into that category. Wake Forest has fallen into that category. Not that they were that important anyway, but what makes all this fascinating about this deal that the ACC has agreed to in this settlement with Clemson and Florida State is that the revenue from the league's multimedia contracts is not going to be split the same way as we've seen. So the Big Ten, this is important to understand from a model perspective. The Big Ten, all of the schools own a part of the Big Ten network, and all of them get equal shares of the media payouts from the other contracts, the NBC contract, the CBS contract, the Fox contract. the SEC network is owned by ESPN and by Hearst, but there's equal payouts to all of the teams in the SEC. The ACC has now gone to a model where the first 40% of the league's multimedia contracts will be split evenly amongst the schools, but the remaining 60% of that, 3/4 of that amount will be split based on football TV viewership, and the remaining quarter will be based on men's basketball viewership. So if you're a Clemson or a Florida State and you're getting big ratings, you are going to get a significantly larger proportion of the money payout from your contract as a league than a team like, say, Cal, who's probably not pulling in very high ratings on their football. That is going to set up, not just in the ACC, a clear stratification, which we've already seen not work, because this is a different version of what the Big 12 did in an attempt to keep Texas and Oklahoma happy.
The Pac-12 too.
Pac-12 did the same thing.
Yeah.
But now this is where it's going to be fascinating. How much money are Clemson and Florida State going to be making? And what do the SEC and Big Ten teams who get significantly higher ratings look at when they are going to renegotiate their own deals? Does Ohio State say, yeah, we're fine getting the same amount of money as Purdue, or Purdue getting the same amount of money as us, even though their ratings are significantly lower? That sets up an envy-based instability in college athletics, which, as we know, is the worst kind of instability in college athletics, because it's the one that's always guaranteed to work.
I'm really curious of why they went down this route for the next 6 years, knowing that they have 6 years to kind of figure this. Not figure it out. They've kind of already kind of have the rings on the wall. But for those schools out at the bottom, like the Boston colleges, the Wake Forest, that really aren't going to bring TV viewership, probably either of those at this point, right? Outside maybe some local viewership, and Wake Forest is probably, I would assume, the lowest out of, maybe not the lowest, but pretty close. How that's going to help? I mean, they're going to be bringing in less revenue. So how are they going to be able to stay relevant going forward? And are they also seeing the writing on the wall, saying, "Hey, we're probably not going to be in the Super League. Let's stay the path for now, and we'll bring in X amount of revenue. Then when we see it's going to diverge into, maybe we'll be an I don't know, who knows what it's going to look like at that point, maybe an FCS school. We'll just go that way, right?" Mm-hmm. So maybe that's what they're thinking. We'll stay here. We know we're screwed regardless. Let's try to be happy for the next 6 years and go forward. But it really seems like the bottom schools are putting themselves in a spot where it's just not. It's not going to be helpful for them. They're just, like you said, burning the clock. Where Clemson and Florida State, the Duke on the basketball side, North Carolina probably just the basketball side. I don't know. Is there any school that's on both sides there? Maybe.
I would say North Carolina is probably the closest, but there's not really an equivalent. But it's interesting if you think about it. What team is equivalent on both sides that isn't just a geographical accident? Like, I would say Texas, maybe, but I don't know. I'm not sure what Texas's basketball ratings look like, but I would say the bread is significantly more buttered on the football side of things.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, you're right. There probably isn't many, but in this specific scenario, like we mentioned here, it's advantageous to be good at least one of them,
right?
And there's a lot of schools in this one that just aren't. Maybe look at the local viewership. I mean, I guess maybe North Carolina is hitting it right with Belichick right now. They'll get some from both. I mean, maybe that's helpful for them for the next couple of years. But I think it's a good point that you make about, if looking at this from a Big Ten lens, how Ohio State is going to view this, and Michigan and Oregon. Oregon's not a full member yet, but the next TV contract, what are they going to say? Do they want to push this forward, or are they going to be staunchly going, "Hey, I think it's time to break off and do this Super League," or whatever it's going to look like in 6 years? And I think that's goes back to our original conversation about the health of the sport. This is probably not the healthiest thing for the sport, having one of their conferences have this type of split money amongst their members. It just doesn't work. And I can't think of one. Maybe it worked for Gonzaga for the WCC for a long time, but that's probably the only one I can think of that worked.
So the one thing I will say to close this off, and I think this is fascinating to ponder. So there was an article that was written. It was a Medium article by Zach Miller, who does a lot of work examining college sports. And he looked at the highest average number of viewers per week for the 2024 season in college football. So the top 5 are not surprising in terms of who had the highest weekly average viewers. Georgia with nearly 6 million viewers a week. Alabama with 5.5 million. Ohio State with 5.1 million. Texas with 4.6. Michigan with 4. Those are the only teams that are at the 4 million and above mark. Now, what's interesting is you start to go down the list, and I'm just going to rattle off the teams down to 25.
Okay.
So we got Florida is 6th, Tennessee's 7th, LSU's 8th, Colorado's 9th because, of course, of the Dion factor. Yeah. Texas A&M is 10th. Then Oklahoma, Notre Dame, Nebraska, Oregon, Penn State. That's 11 through 15. USC, Ole Miss, Miami, Auburn, South Carolina. That's 16 to 20. Georgia Tech is 21st. Iowa is 22nd. Indiana was 23rd. Clemson was 24th. And Florida State was 25th. So, two things there. First of all, I know that there's been so much talk about with Indiana, and obviously we're both affiliated with Indiana in one way or another. You'll get a lot of Indiana-related talk on this. But a lot of people have talked about how Indiana's in trouble if there's ever a Super League. I mean, Indiana's got a higher average or had a higher average TV rating last year than Clemson and Florida State and Arkansas and Wisconsin and Washington. And you could keep going down the list. They're in much better shape than people think that they are. And if you get down into the basically the 6-digit figures, like the sub 1 million average viewers, these are the schools where I think you've got to start being concerned a little bit. And some of it is temporary based upon how much you're winning versus how much you're losing. And it's kind of like a death spiral because the moment you are like, oh, we've got a Peacock game, it's like, uh-oh, that's really going to hurt our average viewership. But, it's like, Mizzou is at 961K. Purdue is at 880. Michigan State is down there. West Virginia is down there. Arizona, Baylor, Louisville, Rutgers, Oregon State, Texas Tech. You almost like this is where, frankly, the television ratings being tied to your revenue distribution gets really, really dangerous because you face a real situation. Like Vanderbilt only pulls in 423,000 people on average per game. Yeah. Maryland only pulls in 386,000 people per game. North Carolina only pulls in 328,000 people a game, which is one of the reasons why they had to go out and sign Bill Belichick, because at least people will watch. But what if he's only there for a year? Right. This is where I think some teams are really going to back themselves into some serious trouble, and where ultimately, because these things bounce up and down every year due to a variety of factors, unless you're taking a rolling average, it's not really painting an accurate picture of who's actually important in college sports and who isn't. And that's I mean, if they did that in the NFL would have broken up a long time ago. Right. And that's the lesson that they probably should be taking, but they don't appear to be taking it, at least not in the ACC. The last thing I'll say, as far as your statement about why did they go down this road, I think if they didn't, I don't know that I think Clemson and Florida State would have just jumped ship. They would have paid the money. They would have made themselves free agents because they would have thought, well, it'll take us 10 years, but we'll make all that money up. And meanwhile, we don't want to be tied to the sinking ship that is the rest of the ACC.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. I know there's numbers out there of $400-500 million. I just couldn't picture that in my head with also going down this road of revenue sharing and everything else that's going on in college athletics, that they would do that right now. But Florida State has been desperate for a while to do something. And I just wanted to point out something with your numbers. Florida State was in the 20s, and they were just to point out this revenue distribution for TV ratings. They were 2-10 last year. They were the worst, maybe the worst team in college football, really. From outside of Purdue, probably one of the worst teams in college football last year. So they were in the top 25, wherever they were.
They were 20. They were 25th.
25th, and
Clemson was 24th.
And they were they were third or fourth in the ACC still, right?
Well, that's the thing. If you go through the ACC, the only ACC team, as I go through here and make sure that my math isn't wrong, that pops up in the top 20 is Miami. Yeah. And one could make the argument they only did that because they were a playoff contender.
They were all year, yeah.
And they do have a cachet of marketing and ratings nationally that the other ones don't necessarily, just because of their history. But it illustrates how bad off the ACC is. And I think that that's ultimately the point that we're so used to thinking of the Power Five or whatever you want to call it, Power Four now, as all being the same. But if you look at it, going down the list and just doing conferences instead of doing anything regarding the individual teams, it goes SEC, SEC, Big Ten, SEC, Big Ten, SEC, 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 Big 12, SEC, SEC, Independent, Big Ten, Big Ten, Big Ten, Big Ten, SEC, ACC, SEC, SEC, ACC, Big Ten, Big Ten, ACC, ACC. You know who looks like they're in worse trouble than the ACC is the Big 12.
Yeah.
Because the only team that they had up in the top ratings was the Dion-led Colorado Buffaloes. That's a problem.
And that's a short term. You would think it's a short term thing until he stops coaching. But yeah, I mean,
he would be a Dallas Cowboy if Jerry Jones cared at this point.
Right. So it's curious, right? The Big 12, unfortunately, there's no brands there anymore, and that's just whatever it is. But that's where the ACC's lucky; they still have a couple of these brands. So to tie it all together, trying to figure out what's best for the college football right now is what's probably hurting maybe the ACC.
On that note, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode. We've been trying to keep these in the 30 to 45 minute range. We almost succeeded this time. But Matt, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I'm looking forward. Well, looking forward to the. Well, I'm leaving for a couple of weeks here, but looking forward to really ramping up here in August and really getting more into the games and stuff and how that balances out with actual college sports as we really get down this road. I'm excited for where we can go with the show. Yeah, I mean, we're going to have a lot to talk about in terms of the different aspects of things with the final recruiting rankings. There's been a lot of interesting stuff there. Yeah. Some teams that you might not expect having some really good recruiting off seasons. And then obviously we'll be previewing some of the conferences as we get into August. We get a little bit closer to the start of football season. Until then, we got to talk about the business stuff. Someone's got to do it. Glad we're doing it. Anyway, for Matt Blaska, I'm Galen Clavius. This is Football Weather. We will catch you folks on the flip side. Enjoy July. Rest up because we got a long football season in front of us, and I'm looking forward to it. Have a good one, folks.